Please remember to leave a like, a comment, share the video about, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Thank you. Well, isn't this just fantastic?
Captain's log, subdates 231108.2. Whenever a gang finds its way into our system, we like to test their gang loyalty by placing them into other gang cells. It always ends the same way though. 50% crack and reform, the other 50% end up shagging each other. I mean, they're here for a long time, but come on. Hello everyone, welcome to the Halls of Injustice. Today we welcome quite a lot of inmates, but we're going to hyper-focus on one of them, so inmates number 185. There's more than 9 of them though, yes, but the one that matters is inmate number 185, nicknamed Dangerous. How exciting. His name is Fortune Lawson. I was originally going to do a YouTube short on the Halls of Injustice YouTube channel, but I decided against it because this one's fascinating. Here is a mugshot of Fortune Lawson. Here is a mugshot of everyone else involved. There are some questions, obvious ones. They are all total being sentenced for an incredibly long time for some rather heinous acts over a fecking watch. Not even a joke. Over something as trivial as a status symbol worn on a wrist. A bit of bling. These men, cretins, are going to be spending the rest of their lives in one of these ISO cubes, and I can think of nobody more deserving than people who are so self-absorbed, so self-obsessed, so selfish that they would want to harm others over a watch. Granted, it was a Rolex, but you know what? It doesn't matter. A Rolex really isn't all that. Storm watches are better. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Fortune Lawson, but there isn't too much to go on, so we're going to dive into the crime straight after. But I will tell you what I know so far. So who is Dangerous Fortune Lawson? Fortune Lawson is a now 27-year-old man who ran what is considered highly organised crime gang in Cardiff. The nature of that gang is not reported in any article, including that of the CPS. He went by the street name Mills or Mills, either with an S or a Z at the end. The gang was from London, many of them from Harrow and Brent. He has committed 2 truly heinous crimes. The second crime was committed while he was being investigated for the first one, both of which are very similar in nature, both of which put every single person in the pictures in prison for lengthy periods of time for involvement in kidnapping, torture, extortion, blackmail, the usual really. Fortune Lawson is the head of the crime gang. He is considered the face of it, and some of the techniques used to get what he wanted from victims was compared by the prosecution, compared by the police, as that of horror film-esque in style. Some of the crimes took place in this room, in a flat in Cardiff, so I guess we should talk about those crimes, shouldn't we? In November of 2018, under false pretenses of discussing cannabis, Fortune Lawson kidnapped a man called Mohammed Soroya outside his home in London. The reason and motivation for this was because on Snapchat he had posted a photograph of him wearing a Rolex watch. They sprung a trap, and this did not go well. Fortune Lawson and 2 others kidnapped and tortured Mr. Soroya until the watch and a ransom was handed over. Over an 8-hour period, he was stabbed multiple times, his eyes gouged, he had boiling water with sugar in it poured over his abdomen and groin. See this room? Yeah, this is where it took place. To keep him under control, they used a gun and a attack dog. He was forced, Mr. Soroya, to call family members to arrange for money and the Rolex to be handed over before he was released. He was found by his cousin and his brother in a car park near Kenton railway station, but he could not get in the car because of the injuries he sustained. He was taken to Northwick Park Hospital where he spent 5 days having treatments. He was also forced to undergo additional surgeries 3 months later. This level of sadism and control made Fortune Lawson believe that he was truly untouchable. So don't be too surprised when you find out that less than 2 years later, he struck again. But in his untouchable state, he developed a level of arrogance. That arrogance became his undoing and the gang's undoing. A typical MO for Fortune Lawson was to target and plan extortions for those that he trusted, and they in turn trusted him. so it wasn't a surprise he'd used them to get what he wanted from them because clearly he hadn't had enough. On the 11th of December 2020, Fortune Lawson struck again luring another person who I'm going to call John Doe because I don't actually have their name to hand, under false pretenses to again discuss cannabis. They picked this person up, drove him to a flat in Odette Court, Cardiff. He was put into an Audi Q5, blindfolded and handcuffed, where he was then transferred to Livingston Walk in Hemel Hempstead. They had pounced on this man, one wielding another gun. He was stripped, bound, beaten, waterboarded, and then put back in the car to be taken to Hemel Hempstead. What they did continued for over 25 hours, during which time they attempted to push his head into a toilet, used again an attack dog to control him. An agreement was reached between the victim's captors and his friend over the phone to pay £50,000 for his release, with the money to be collected from Bristol. But what the gang did not know was that the victim's friend was smart enough to call the police, and specialist hostage negotiators had overseen the ransom discussions, and inquiries had led police to identify where he was being held. Officers then raided the flat at the same time as the agreed money drop and found the victim bound, shaking, with the obvious signs of having been assaulted. But this wasn't the only one. See, the police had identified a second victim from DNA at the Cardiff flat. This person would reveal he was held against his will and subjected to violent assaults. He had been pounced upon by several men, threatened with a knife, wounded to the head and told to remain silent. From their accounts, investigators discovered that the victims of plot A and B, so what we just discussed in 2020 and this one, had been held in the flat at the same time. Fortune Lawson had even asked one to interpret what the other was saying. What had happened in 2018, the police were investigating Fortune Lawson for, but didn't have enough to go on until these arrests happened, because then they had properties they could search. That enabled them to then dig further and find that actually he had extorted, he had blackmailed, he had tortured Mr. Soroya in 2018 and had managed to get £5,000 and the Rolex watch from family. So I guess with all this information, we should probably get to the trial and the sentence of a lot of inmates, but mostly inmates number 185, Dangerous Fortune Lawson. In total, 9 people were arrested. You have Fortune Lawson, Dawood Asadpour, Micaiah Mali, Arnold Fumumeya, Alexis Mutessa, Gideon Lawson, Ahmed Omar, Dennis Delishaj, and Stephen Isaac. Stephen Isaac's involvement was that his flat was the one being used to torture people in exchange for drugs. Omar was a lookout. Dennis was the ransom negotiator from 2020. Gideon is Fortune Lawson's brother. Alexis is the muscle of the group, along with Arnold and Micaiah Mali. Dawood Asadpour played a leading role in the acts of torture with Fortune Lawson and Micaiah Mali. It took the police 3 years to get this to go to court. This was confirmed by Darren George, who is the detective superintendent and head of the South Wales Police Major Crime Investigation Team, who had said this has been one of the UK's most complicated kidnap investigations in recent times, and it has taken 3 years to convict 9 individuals. Because they all did no comment and not guilty, when this went to trial, all the events discussed in the crime were laid bare during the trial, verbatim in fact. The only difference being there were additional details they knew, for example, Mr. Ibrahimi being the victim from 2020 who I had called John Doe, a name I did not know until that moment. They had used cable ties as suitable restraint along with ropes, and that in this instance, in 2020, they had attempted and threatened to use boiling water from a kettle in the waterboarding. Fortune Lawson had also attended the flat in the early hours of the morning when they were about to get arrested, and he had been bragging that he had done similar kidnappings in other cities, including Sheffield and Leeds, because this was his gang life, to find, kidnap and extort. Now we know what the gang does, or did. While they had attempted to extort 100,000 from Mr. Ibrahimi, they managed to get 50,000 for the release, and that if the police were involved, the captive would be unalive immediately. Obviously that didn't go to plan because they failed. What made this incredibly difficult for the police, and it was also pointed out in the trial, was that this team, all 9 of them, were experts in forensics, so finding any information or details or traceable information was difficult beyond the flat where they were busted. The gang also had access to weapons, which is why this was dubbed a fairly military-esque gang. Fortune Lawson was not actually arrested with the gang when they were busted. He was caught in Hendon, North London. Others were arrested at their flats because they were in other locations at the time, or because they'd gone to go and collect the money from Bristol. Some had gone to the airport, like Dennis, had gone to the airport to try and leave. Some of them tried to do that twice. In not one of the articles I've linked in the pinned comment is there a reference as to whether or not any of the 9 people pled guilty or not. I am going to infer though that they did not, because this trial went on for a while, and owing to the nature of their sentences, I'm inclined to believe that not a single one of them showed an ounce of remorse. They were all found guilty of various charges. The charges are quite extensive. Obviously in this I want to focus on Fortune Lawson, but I cannot ignore the fact the other 8 men involved all received sentences for their involvement in the kidnap, the torture. So let us go to the sentence of Fortune Lawson and mention everyone else at the same time, because collectively they've got an incredibly long sentence, and it's worth mentioning. Stephen Isaac was convicted of 2 kidnap charges, 3 false imprisonment charges and 1 of blackmail, and sentenced to 6 years in custody. Dennis, convicted of 1 count of blackmail and 1 possession of a mobile phone in prison without authorization, 8 years and 8 months in prison. Ahmed Omar, 2 counts of kidnap, 2 counts of false imprisonment, 1 count of blackmail, sentenced to 9 years in custody. Gideon Lawson, 2 counts of kidnap, 3 counts of false imprisonment, 1 count of blackmail, 15 years, 12 of which in custody with an extended license of 3 years. Alexis Mutessa, 2 counts of kidnap, 3 false imprisonment, 1 blackmail, 16 years, 13 years in custody with an extended license of 3 years. Arnold Fumumeya, 2 counts of kidnap, 3 false imprisonment, 1 blackmail, 16 years, also 13 years in custody with an extended license of 3 years. Mikaya Mali, 2 counts of kidnap, 3 false imprisonment, 1 blackmail, 19 years with 15 of those in custody, the rest on license, an extended license. Davood Asadpour, same counts, 19 years in prison, 15 in custody. Fortune Lawson though, the ringleader, involved in all 3 plots, found guilty of all charges mentioned but an additional charge of kidnap and an additional charge of false imprisonment. 30 years in prison, 25 years of that in custody with an extended license of 5 years. I earlier mentioned he's only 27 years old. He has essentially thrown his life away because he'd rather extort people than simply do something with his life for better. And now he has a minimum of 25 years to think about. Not one of them deserves any less than the sentence they got. I'm somewhat impressed Dennis only got 8 years and 8 months since he twice tried to leave the country without authorization. All of you deserve this, and if you were sentenced by my ruling, you'd be on Titan working the mines for the rest of your lives.